Hello, you're listening to Human Conditions, a podcast about radical 20th century thinkers, which is part of the LRB's Close Reading series. I'm your host, Adam Schatz, and this is the first of 4 episodes with Brent Hayes-Edwards, a scholar of African American and Francophone literature and of jazz studies at Columbia University. Brent, a writer and thinker of uncommon elegance, wears many hats. He's a historian of Black literature and the author of the classic study, The Practice of Diaspora. He's an accomplished translator, most recently of Michel Leiris's classic work, Phantom Africa, and he is the co-author of the composer and saxophonist Henry Threadgill's new memoir, Easily Slip into Another World. He's also an incisive writer of essays on jazz and of liner notes. He is, in short, the ideal person with whom to have a conversation about the contribution of Black thinkers to 20th century debates about power, identity, aesthetics, resistance, race, and, of course, freedom. The subject of our first conversation is the ur-text of Black political philosophy, The Souls of Black Folk, published in 1903 by the historian, sociologist, novelist, editor, and political activist William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, better known as W.E.B. Du Bois. Thanks for joining us, Brent.
Nice to be here.
Du Bois published The Souls of Black Folk with the Chicago firm of A.G. McClurg and Company at age 35. The book is a collection of 14 essays, 9 of which had been previously published in the major publications of the day, including the Atlantic Monthly. But it reads very much like a through-composed work, both in its argument and in its tonalities. Its music, and indeed music, the sorrow songs of African Americans, are very much a part of Du Bois's concerns. The book is both a harrowing account of the impact of racism on the experience, the life prospects, and the psyche of Black Americans, and a moving and often poetic evocation of the ways in which Black Americans have made themselves a people in the most adverse conditions, contributing to the country their enslaved ancestors built, their unique gifts, their culture, their spirit. The book is also a record beneath the surface of an encounter of a Black man from the East Coast, from Great Barrington, Massachusetts, with the Black folk of the South. In other words, Du Bois's own discovery of the souls of Black folk, whose praises he sings much as Tolstoy did the souls of Russian peasants. The context of its composition is crucial. Du Bois was writing in a period of great despair, less than 3 decades after the defeat of Reconstruction, against the backdrop of a cruel Jim Crow apartheid system in the South, the rise of lynchings, the intensification of efforts to deprive Black people of the rights that they had won, including the right to anything other than a vocational or industrial education. In the essays that comprise this book, Du Bois introduces the ideas and phrases that would reframe the discussion of race, Black American identity, and Blackness in a world dominated by whiteness, most famously the concepts of the color line and double consciousness. In the words of Du Bois's biographer, David Levering Lewis, The Souls of Black Folk was an electrifying manifesto mobilizing a people for a bitter, prolonged struggle to win a place in history, and its 14 essays were like, in Lewis's words, fireworks going off in a cemetery. Du Bois feared that his book would be stillborn in the wilderness of the world, as he put it, but this was far from the case. James Weldon Johnson said the book's impact was greater upon and within the Negro race than any other single book published in this country since Uncle Tom's Cabin. Max Weber, who arranged for a German translation, wrote to Du Bois from Heidelberg that he would be happy to write a preface to his splendid book. The book went into its 3rd printing only 3 months after its publication, in spite of the efforts by his Black critics, the so-called Tuskegee machine led by Booker T. Washington, to prevent it from being discussed in the Black press. The Southern white press reacted with fury. The Nashville American declared it dangerous for the Negro to read and accused its author of inciting rape. Brent, when we were discussing books that you might talk about, you brooded a bit over which books to include. There were so many, but you never hesitated when it came to The Souls of Black Folk. What makes this book so important to Black intellectual history and indeed to modern intellectual and political history?
Well, it's uncommon, I would say, for a book to inaugurate an age. This book sets the tone and template and terminology for Black literature, political debate, and scholarly production over the course of the following century. It's a book that pretty overtly says, right from its first sentences, we are at the dawn of a new century and a shift in historical period. And if you think about the period at which Du Bois is gathering these pieces, which he described as fugitive pieces. They're articles that he had been publishing in places like The Dial and The Atlantic Monthly that he gathers and reworks into the book that becomes Soul. That period is often described as the nadir for African Americans. It's a period where African Americans are suffering under Jim Crow oppression, rampant violence, the resurgence of the KKK and lynching. There's very little culturally and in terms of political uplift and civil rights, very little going on. And Du Bois's, that's why David Levering Lewis calls it Fireworks in a Cemetery, because it's as though this collection comes out of nowhere and it's not just that it makes a lot of noise, but it's that it kind of sets the framework for everything that follows, whether we're talking about the great works of the African American literary tradition. You think of Ralph Ellison or Richard Wright or Toni Morrison, James Weldon Johnson, or the civil rights activism of the NAACP going up through the civil rights movement and people like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King in the 1960s. This book kind of gives us a whole vocabulary that resonates over the course of the next century.
When did you first read Souls of Black Folk?
I read it first as an undergraduate in an African American literature class. I was an undergraduate, but was allowed to sit in on a graduate seminar. And when we read it, it was a class on classics of the African American literary tradition. So we were reading more literary works, but we read Souls. And as I said, the Souls gives a kind of frame that we then employed in thinking about the other works on the syllabus.
Do you recall the impact that it had on you when you first read it? And I ask this too because the language of Souls of Black Folk is very specific, and it's not as immediately accessible as, say, Notes of a Native Son or some of Richard Wright's work.
I think it's hard to reconstruct my first...
Your baptismal experience.
It's a book, and I would describe other books the same way. Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks. I have a copy of that book with multiple layers of notes, which record some of my confusion the first time I read Fanon. And Du Bois, it's similarly a stratified text. There are multiple frames. It's as though you're ushered into a set of worlds and a set of terms for understanding those worlds that it takes some time to figure out. So it's a text that introduces you to not just a terminology, a vocabulary for understanding the place of race in the modern world, but it has its mysteries. Mm-hmm. It has its shadows.
It operates on the lower frequencies, as Ellison would have put it.
Yeah. So starting with one of the first mysteries that you confront as a reader is those epigraphs. What are we to make of those pairings of mostly, although not exclusively, excerpts from the Western European poetic tradition? There are a few passages from poems by Schiller and Symonds and Elizabeth Barrett Browning.
Byron,
Childe Harold. But then there's one chapter, the last chapter, that starts with a bit of a lyric from a Negro spiritual, from one of the African American religious songs of the 19th century. There's one chapter, the Black Belt chapter, chapter 7, that starts with an excerpt from the Bible, from the Song of Solomon. So it's not quite just classics of the Western literary tradition.
And there are pairings with musical notation too.
And that's where the mystery lies, is how are we meant to read these snippets of poetry next to just bars of music? He is carefully, as he explains in the last chapter in the Sorrow Songs, in the chapter on the spirituals, he has carefully paired these bars of music with the poetic excerpts that he uses as epigraphs, but he doesn't explain that on the way. So he's chosen particular ones. The spiritual that is there is the epigraph of chapter 4 of The Meaning of Progress. It's My Ways Cloudy is the title of that spiritual, but that title is not provided. When you get to that chapter, you just see bars of music. And if you don't know how to read music, you're not sure what it is. It doesn't even say until that last chapter when he explains the sources of each of the epigraphs that they are spirituals, which spiritual it is. So there's already a kind of an interesting opacity there where you have to figure out how to navigate this pairing. And to me, as the book unfolds, it's a model of dialectical thinking. It's a model of thesis and antithesis that strive toward a certain synthesis.
Do you think that he's also challenging the very racialized hierarchy of European culture and Black culture by pairing excerpts from Byron and other poets with the sorrow songs. Because he clearly thinks the sorrow songs, and we'll get to this later, have a great philosophical meaning.
Well, that's the provocation that becomes clear as you move through the book and have to figure out how to think through those framing gestures, those paired epigraphs. It's as though it's an enactment of that proposition, the famous line toward the beginning of Souls where he says, "I sit with Shakespeare and he winces not." That the African-American literary and intellectual and musical tradition can sit with the high points of European literary culture. They're on the same plane. At the same time, there's a kind of deliberate unevenness there. Like, what does it mean to say musical notation is equal to quoted poetry? So it forces you to think about, okay, what is musical notation? What's being caught in that system of writing as opposed to the lines of poetry, as opposed to the Lord Byron lines that are being quoted next to it? It forces you, rather than putting them in the same language, as it were, it pairs them and says they're on the same page, but they speak different languages. So as a reader, you have to think, well, how do I put music and words together? And that's a really useful exercise as you go along. But to me, as a reader, it's also a provocation and a confrontation. You're not sure what to do with it at first. So as a reader, you have to figure it out as you go along. You could also say that because these pieces are so disparate, because they just generically are autobiography, criticism, history, biography, fiction, you could say music criticism or music history, sociology, political critique, that the coherence of the epigraphs serves to kind of weave or sew the collection together and give it a coherence. He said, Du Bois, in 1904, so the year after the publication of Souls, was asked to write a self-review by this journal called The Independent, which was a really interesting exercise. It's a short self-review, but it's interesting to see him reflect a year later on what he had accomplished. He didn't know the book was going to be a hit. He didn't know it was going to set the terms of debate. And he worries in that self-review. He says, these were fugitive pieces that I collected that maybe have too much disparity among them. They're written for different purposes, for different audiences, and they're abrupt transitions of style. This is his phrasing. There's a kind of incompleteness and sketchiness to the book. At the same time, he says there's a unity of purpose in Souls. And it's in the epigraphs and the way they weave the book together that you start to see that unity of purpose. That actually, it's not just I've thrown a lot of disparate things together, but I have to take a multifaceted approach to what was then called the Negro problem, to the question of race in the modern era. You can't just approach it as a sociologist. Mm-hmm. You can't just approach it as a historian. You can't just approach it through fiction. You have to take a multi-pronged approach.
Thanks for listening to this extract from Human Conditions, a close reading series from the London Review of Books. To listen to the full episode and all our other close reading series, sign up to our close reading subscription at lrb.me/close readings or click on the link in the description.